Stanford University.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about a project that in some ways is at a smaller scale than what we've been hearing prior to this. However, I would argue that there's a lot of contextual overlap here, and the common theme is we're talking about making difficult decisions involving substantial resources about very complicated systems. And so I'm going to sort of shrink things down. I'm not going to tackle the globe. I'm going to shrink things down a little bit, both in scale and in scope in terms of the types of processes, but try to talk about how what we need to know to be able to make difficult decisions about a particular system, and that's the systems. They really are systems, it's not singular. The systems that occur when we bring together rivers, sediment, and dams. So sort of the collision of those three things and what we can learn about how those systems function together and how that supports making decisions. I'm going to do that. I'd like to remind you just a little bit about rivers, sediments, and dams. You all have some exposure, but I just want to highlight a few features and then give you some examples of the kinds of things we've been able to learn and are continuing to learn that we hope will support some decision making. So to remind you about rivers, as a hydrologist, when I think of rivers, the kinds of things that come to mind when making decisions about rivers are it's worth remembering that rivers are extraordinarily dynamic components of the environment. They're not a static thing. You look on a map, it's a little blue line, it looks like there's just the river. But the fact of the matter is that they are always changing, and they're always changing over a wide variety of time scales. So things are changing, some things are changing very quickly, some things are changing very slowly, but they're always changing, and that dynamism is a very important aspect in both how we interact with rivers as humans and how ecosystems develop that are dependent on them. And there are extraordinarily important ecosystems that are adapted to this highly dynamic environment. You can argue, since I'm a rivers guy, the riverine ecosystems are in many ways much more dynamic and diverse systems than terrestrial systems, largely because of this intense variability that occurs in rivers over time and to some degree over space as well. So we have a dynamic environment that supports complex, ever-changing ecosystems that are adapted to that dynamic environment. And in addition, and this is the important connection then about decision making, is these rivers form the most accessible water resource. So if we look historically, the place where we went to look for water to use for purposes, both for us as individuals and as well as our economies, are for rivers. And so they are the most accessible, exploitable, and as a result have been the most profoundly affected elements of the aquatic environment. So these are the characteristics about rivers that I want you to keep in mind. Now, rivers move water, but they move a lot of other things as well. And so another key element in thinking about rivers and human interaction with rivers is that at the same time as water is being cycled through the environment from precipitation to the oceans and back around again, earthen materials are also being circulated through the environment. So we have the continents, portions of the continents are being uplifted, and they're being eroded away largely by the processes of water, some wind, but mainly water, and eventually are being transported to other parts of the environment and ultimately into the ocean via rivers. The little schematic global map there, the size of the black arrow shows the delivery of sediments into the oceans from different parts of the globe. The shading on the continents reflects the amount of sediments that are delivered. It's highly variable from one location to another, depends a lot on the underlying geology, but it also depends on the hydrologic processes that erode, transport, and move this sediment through the environment. This, by the way, is the mouth of the Yangtze River in China. So classic, is once we've gotten the ability to have satellite photos, it's really easy to appreciate the effect of rivers in delivering sediment, so you can see the sediment plume as it enters the ocean and cycling this material through the environment. So now the interesting question is what happens when we build big structures or little structures or any structures in that transport system that transports water and sediment across the environment and makes those things available to us for our use. So just to remind you, we like dams. We've built lots and lots of dams because they do provide significant benefits for humans. This, every little dot you see on here of looking just at the US, every dot represents a large dam. There are about 84,000 dots on that. The color reflects the height. So in this particular database, which is called the National Inventory of Dams, this is the most recent update. There are 84,000 of these, and you can see that they're scattered widely across the country. We have a lot of highlands out here in the west because of topography. There are a lot of factors that go into this. Interestingly enough, if we put a dot on this map for every barrier in a channel that affects the flow of water and sediment, there are some, we actually have no idea how many there are in the US as a whole, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of a couple million. So we would see almost no white. It would be all colored, unless we chose white dots for the little ones. So the little ones would fill everything else in. So we have constructed a substantial population of dams in the US, and the picture is very similar globally. So hopefully the kinds of things we're learning about focusing in on particular cases are generalizable because of the importance of this particular type of infrastructure to our society and to our ecosystems. Now, an important part of that infrastructure is revealed by this little timeline here. This is one that I'm sure some of you have seen before one way or another. So what I've plotted here on the right-hand side are by decades of the 20th century, the number of dams in from that previous picture, so just in the US, the number of dams that were completed in that decade. And then on the far left, you see all the other dams that are tall, are big, that fit into this database, that either predate the 20th century, or there are some in there when we don't actually know when they were built, but we think they're old. But the important thing to note about this timeline is that there is a very clear peak. We clearly increased in our ability and our effort at constructing dams in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then we've seen a dramatic decline since then. Now, there are a couple of things that represents. For one thing, the little green labels here that are all using little just shorthands represent 4 pieces of national legislation that reflect a substantial evolution in our values about the role of rivers and streams and their value to humans. So we have the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, all occurring right sort of at the beginning of the downside of that plot. So we have a substantial evolution in our understanding of what we value in the environment and what we value in terms of our interaction with it. And that has also occurred with the fact that we've built out a lot of our dam sites, and when we initially constructed many of these, we designed them based on projections, the kind of projections that you've heard about earlier, projections that are typically 25, 50 years into the future. And in fact, we put together infrastructure that did pretty well for 25 and 50 years into the future. The interesting thing is, we now have a lot of old dams. We have a whole lot of very old dams. These dams are old enough that the dams themselves present some interesting challenges as structures, but we have a lot of other dams that are sort of 40, 50, and 60 years old. In many cases, not all, in many cases the structures are intact, but the stuff that makes it work, all the valves and pipes and knobs and electrical systems, they're all starting to get old. And so we have reached a point where we're going to start making a lot of decisions about what to do about that aging population of dams. Are we going to reinvest? Are we going to renew the structures and the facilities? Are we going to expand them? Or are we going to remove them? And so we are headed toward an interesting period of time making decisions about a very substantial investment in our rivers via dams. So the challenges that this poses, I think you can think of them sort of in three broad categories for what I'd like to talk about. One is we get lots of benefits from dams, but they are unquestionably ecologically disruptive. They disrupt the flow of water, and they disrupt the flow of things in that water, including sediment and fish and insects and many, many other elements of our ecosystems. We are going to have to make major investment decisions, and we have to deal with the fact that we're going to be making those decisions based on the fact that dams substantially disrupt, to some ways more than they disrupt the flow of water, they disrupt the flow of sediment. And they do that by retaining sediment. This is one of my, some of you have seen this before, one of my favorite Searsville photos. The flood of record at Searsville Dam in late 1997, water year 1998. Here we have two sample bottles. This bottle was collected at the main creek that flows into the reservoir at the upstream end of the reservoir. This is the bottle of the water that at the same time was going downstream out of the reservoir. So reservoirs trap sediments. And that's what I'd like to focus on for the rest of my talk. So the challenges that we face in understanding how we're going to make decisions about this resource, given that they trap sediments. And I would argue there are three broad questions that are driving what we're doing. We're trying to understand, how does sediment actually accumulate in reservoirs? I'll try to show you that it doesn't accumulate the way that we have assumed when we've been designing and building them. What are the consequences of that accumulation? And then what happens if we remove a dam or alter a dam or somehow change the system? And so those are the underlying questions that we think have to be answered if we're going to be able to make decisions about dams in our future. So interestingly enough, when we build dams, the way we assess the impact on sediment retention is almost universally based on this plot right here, which is known as the Broom Curve, right? 1953. And what Broom plotted is the fraction of the sediment, all right, that's trapped. Okay? And along this axis is essentially the ratio of how big the reservoir is relative to how much water is coming in. Now, there are a couple interesting things about this curve. One is, it's never been published, actually once, it's never been published with the actual data points that were used to construct this curve. And there's a reason for that. Interestingly enough, all the data points are right up here, and there are no data points down here. Okay? That's one interesting problem. It turns out I can't even, the only copy I've ever found of the original plot is a crumbled paper copy that I can't even get a good scan on. So I'm working on getting a decent presentation of that. The other thing is that this is based on the behavior of new reservoirs. So if you have a new reservoir of a given size, and you know how big the stream is coming in, the idea is that this will predict what fraction is being trapped. The trouble is we have mostly old reservoirs. And old reservoirs don't just shift. So as a reservoir fills up with sediment, it doesn't just move its way down this axis so that you would say, well, gee, as it goes on, it's going to trap less and less and less sediment over time. It turns out it doesn't work that way. And what we've been trying to do is try to understand why and how that happens. So let me illustrate that in a couple of ways. Here are some data from Searsville that I do study. It's just 20 minutes away from here. Mainly what I like to emphasize is, so here we have an elevation axis, and here we have the volume of water below a particular elevation. So let's just take the dam crest. Right? And so here you can see, you can watch Searsville filling with sediment. And what you see is it fills very non-uniformly over time. Right? So it was finished in 1892. We had a big slug of incoming sediment that lost water volume in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Then a very quiet period, and things got very exciting again in the 1990s. That's no surprise. Here we have the 1906 earthquake, and here we have the 1989 earthquake. But that's another story I don't have time for today. The point is that Searsville is filling up. It's trapping sediment rather effectively. It's not doing it uniformly over time. Remember, this is a dynamic system, and so it's even hard to study. I really envy Steve and Vina's work because he managed in a 45-year period to get the drought of record and the flood of record in the same period. I mean, that's every hydrologist's dream, but it never happens. So it happened once, yes, and they were smart enough to be there when it happened. Perfect. And fortunately, we have much more data about Searsville than we have about many other reservoirs, which has allowed us to get a picture of what's going on. But perhaps most interesting, and the reason why that Broom Curve is problematic, is that if we look at the sediment accumulation in Searsville in a slightly different way. So here we have a cross section. So this is elevation versus distance. There is the dam. There's the base of the dam. There's the height of the dam. This is the approximate ground surface at the time the dam was constructed. Here you see the sediment surface. This little thin line is the sediment surface when this survey was done, which was in 1995, 1996. So you can see that in the reservoir itself, where the water was, all of this area is now sediment, and so the water storage capacity has been reduced down to that. And the Broom Curve is based on the notion of a reservoir as a bathtub, that is, you pour sand in and fill it up, and then if you bring more water in, why, it'll overflow, and a declining fraction of the material will be left behind. The problem is that it's not a bathtub, and what we see is that a very large fraction of the sediment is actually deposited well above the water surface elevation. It's not actually captured in the reservoir. It's captured on an alluvial surface above the reservoir. And that's why the Broom Curve doesn't work. All right? And so we figured that out. Now we have to figure out whether we can predict that in a particular case, and that's a different challenge. Just to give you some illustrations, here you see San Clemente Dam on the Carmel River, so a dam that has gotten a lot of attention recently. And one of the issues there is that this used to be the reservoir going off that way, and what you can see here is the sediment surface, the surface of the sediment deposit, and you can see that it is, and the reservoir itself extends for literally dozens of kilometers upstream around the bend there, and it's all now sediment surface. And in fact, much of the new sediment deposit is occurring on top of that. It's not occurring down here right by the dam. So a very different process of deposition. Another view is Searsville. So here we have an aerial view of Searsville. There's the dam, and this is Sand Hill Road, for those of you who know the area. What I've outlined here in the frame of this particular aerial photo with the red line is where the shoreline was when the dam was completed. Okay? And so if we had taken this photo in 1892, we would see this color of water covering this entire area. Now we actually have 3 lakes. We have Lower Lake, Middle Lake, and Upper Marsh, as it's known. And you can see that this entire area here is no longer water surface. It, in fact, is sediment surface that is high enough that it supports what is, in fact, a thriving, and in fact, on the peninsula, indeed, unique ecosystem. Right? Happens to support the highest density of nesting songbirds in the Bay Area. On this particular riparian swamp wetland that has developed on this sediment surface because it's above the lake elevation. This creates some interesting dilemmas, and what we're trying to do is to understand exactly how that works. And so the way the sediment is deposited is the streams are now on top of the sediment. They used to come in 30 feet down. They're now coming in on top of the sediment. When they overflow, they deposit all their sediment right next to the channel, and so they gradually build up the sediment around here. That influences where the vegetation grows. The vegetation then influences where the sediment is deposited. So you have this very interesting set of feedback loops, and we're trying very hard using both field observations, new larger scale survey methods based on both aerial and satellite imagery, as well as on-the-ground analysis, coupled with mathematical models to try to predict how this sediment accumulates, how that interacts with the vegetation, how those two things sort of circularly develop over time. The next set of questions is, well, what does all this mean? What are the consequences of this? And so to use Searsville as an example, we are again trying to figure out was going on when we take a reservoir that was a reservoir and we fill up most of it with sediment. Right? Because now we have a very different set of flows through the system. Sediment is now being trapped on the surface. The streams are coming in much higher than they used to. Okay? Much of the water that comes in the streams is going into the subsurface and then flowing in the subsurface into the reservoir. And interestingly enough, some times of the year, water is flowing from the reservoir into the sediments, and other times of the year, it's flowing from the sediments out to the reservoir. Right? That may seem like a little nicety, but in fact it isn't, because in many reservoirs, thankfully not Searsville, or I wouldn't be able to work there, in many reservoirs, the sediments are contaminated. That's another little piece of the picture. And so this moving of water back and forth between the sediments and the reservoir is a potential source of pumping contaminants in and out of the water and the sediments. So understanding how this system works and functions as a new sort of artificial environment is important for figuring out how we're going to make decisions about its fate. To do that, we use a combination, once again, of field methods and models, mathematical models that try to characterize the flow of water and sediment. So we go out and we install a bunch of instruments to allow us to observe water in the subsurface as well as water in the surface. I put this in to remind you that dozens and dozens of students have learned that field work is noisy and dirty, but have fun doing it. And as a result, we've learned a lot of interesting things about this somewhat exotic and yet universally widespread ecosystem, hydrologic system that we have constructed unintentionally by building dams and reservoirs. This little plot here is a timeline for just a couple of years. Up here we have rainfall on this axis on the right-hand side. So it goes down, it gets bigger. So here you can see the pattern of rainfall over those 2 years. Here is the ground surface at one location where we measured what's going on in the subsurface. And that's what this little green and blue lines show. So this is the level of groundwater at that location. And then here we have the lake water surface elevation. Okay? So what we see are things, again, that were not anticipated at the time of design and have led us to rethink what's going on in the system. For one thing, we see that we have a strong seasonality. We have lots of variability in the groundwater. The groundwater levels, that plot looks more like stream flow, and it goes up and down incredibly rapidly. And what's interesting is that there are communities of plants that thrive in that setting. And that's one reason why the ecosystem there is so special, because it's growing in a very special environment that doesn't happen in a lot of other areas. So we have lots of variability, we have seasonality. This is the root zone, so this has a strong influence on what kind of plants grow, whether we get shrubs or sedges or trees. And that then feeds back into how sediment accumulates, because this line is actually changing as well as we go along. Looking more closely, we've learned an interesting thing that is in some ways of academic interest, but in other ways is we think we can turn this into something very useful to try to characterize that sediment deposit. One of the real challenges with the subsurface, particularly the kind of subsurface that we've created in reservoirs, is that it's very hard to understand what it actually looks like down there. In this case, we have trees that have fallen down, we have vegetation, we have a wide range of particle sizes. The channel has moved over time back and forth. And so characterizing the subsurface is a really difficult challenge. And one interesting thing we learned is that this system breathes, and it breathes in a really interesting way. So what I've plotted here, this is the larger scale time. So this is over multiple years of the water surface, the groundwater elevation, and the stream flow of the main stream that's coming in. But if we look very closely and just look over a very short period of time, so we're basically 3 days here, if we look at each of these things, we find that every day the water levels are going up and down. Okay? So the stream flow is going up and down, the reservoir levels going up and down, and the groundwater levels are going up and down. And it's non-trivial. It's on the order of that much in some places. Well, what's really interesting is they're not going up and down at the same time. They're all going up and down once a day, but they go up at different. So what's happening is the stream flow changes. That influences how much water is coming into the reservoir. The reservoir is moving, but it's influenced by how much water is going in and out from the groundwater, and it's influenced by how much water is evaporating from plants and the surface. And so this is actually driven by evaporation. Right? And so it's driven by solar energy, which is why it's daily. But what we've discovered here is that each of them breathes at a somewhat different amount, and its timing is shifted. And what we've discovered, we think we've discovered, is that we can use those time shifts to learn more about what's going on in the subsurface. In the meantime, it's kind of cool to know the whole system is going up and down like that every day. Well, the third piece of the puzzle is what happens if we try to alter these systems? What if either because the dam is in such a condition that it needs to be removed or needs to be altered, we're going to make decisions about the structures that are in these systems with these complicated constructed hydrologic aquatic ecosystems. What happens if we change them? And so that's the third piece of the puzzle. Just to give you a sense of why this is important, here is a little schematic of some dams in the west that are the subject of intense study for removal of one sort or another. So here is San Clemente that we just looked at the photo. So you can see that the yellow here is the sediment accumulation, and the blue is supposed to indicate the amount of water. So you can see that if San Clemente were to be removed, we've got a big blob of sediment there that we have to think about what's going to happen, what's going to go on. Elwha and Glines Canyon are on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. Those are the two that are probably most likely to be removed amongst this group for a variety of reasons. You can guess which one of these is upstream and which one is downstream, because the upstream one catches a bigger fraction of the sediment coming in, so there's not as much going into the one that's downstream. These are upstream and downstream of each other. But Tillahaz down in the Ventura, it also is probably going to be removed. It's where the process is moving along. In this case, most of these are not providing enough benefits to justify leaving them in place given their ecological impacts. But the big challenge in removal of all of those is the sediment management. Getting the dam out, I mean, we can always get the dam out. The question is, how do we get the dam out in a way that is safe, and how do we manage those sediments? I can't resist putting in O'Shaughnessy. I had to do a talk 2 days ago about, I had to participate in a debate about the removal of O'Shaughnessy Dam, and there, one of the interesting issues is there are almost no sediment in that reservoir. And I would argue that's a very exotic situation, but that points to you why decision-making is so complex. In any case, the interesting question for us at Searsville, for example, is if we take out the dam, what's going to happen to that 120 years of sediment that's being collected? All right? How much of it is going to go downstream? Right? And what's the channel going to do? Are we going to erode out a narrow, thin canyon up through all this sediment deposit? Or is, over time, is all this sediment going to erode out naturally? Or do we have to go in and dredge it out before we would be able to remove the dam? These are, I should point out, these are all hypothetical questions about the fate of Searsville Dam. Oh, no, today I'm talking about problems, not answers. But what we'd like to do to get an answer is to be able to predict what would happen. And that's what we're trying to do once again through field observations, studying the dam removals that are occurring and have occurred, and try to get out and get instrumented and collect data, as well as develop modeling tools that will help us better predict. Predicting the erosion, transport, and deposition of sediment is probably one of the hardest physical processes to do. Because we've got all those little grains running around in a very complex fluid flow, and figuring out how to do that is a non-trivial problem, and that we're chipping away at it. To give you some idea of what we've been able to do so far, we've been focusing on two things. One is, what's going to happen to that ecosystem that's now supporting all those nesting songbirds on that sediment? And then the question about what's going to happen to the sediment. So here we see some results of a recent graduate, Mei Chui, who is now teaching in Singapore. And she looked at using a mathematical model combined with field data to try to look at alternative scenarios in terms of what they might mean about how water flows through this system. So she looked at, well, what if we let it fill up with sediment? What if we lower the dam? It will be filled with sediment, but it will be lower. What if we leave it in place but dredge out and recover more useful water volume? Or what if we remove it? Now, these are very simple modeling exercises. We're a long way from being able to actually model Searsville in its entirety. So these are essentially schematics. But what she was able to do is by combining what we know about the flow of water and the resulting impact on ecosystems is try to understand and be able to predict consequences. So one thing that we learned, for example, is if we look at the seasonal fluctuation of, this is how much water is being evaporated, either from the water surface or from the plants, we see that there is a rather substantial impact if the dam will be removed. And so now the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to be able to sustain some of the wetland, or are we going to lose all the wetland and end up with invasive grasses? And so we used a generic model to try to understand the overall effect, and now we have to turn that, the next step is to turn that into more specificity in terms of the particular communities of plants that can survive under these different conditions. In terms of what's happening in the sediment, we're right back to the similar problem we had with the Broom Curve. All right, so the Broom Curve was a 1953 result that everyone now believes. We know it isn't true. And the way we have been dealing with what happens to sediment when we remove dams is to build conceptual diagrams. So this is what it ought to look like when we take the water out, and here's the sediment, and we gradually get a channel, and it follows its way back up. And over time, it's going to widen out. We generally proceed with that kind of qualitative sense of what's going to happen. And that works very well for the very, very large fraction of small dams that are relatively easily removed and have a relatively small amount of sediment. But when we start thinking about bigger dams with more sediment, we need to be able to do better than to just say, qualitatively, this is what's going to happen. The reason I say that is because we know that that's not what happens. So here are a few examples. Here is a removal. This is the consequence of a dam removal in Wisconsin on Brewster Creek. And what we see here is this is part of the sediment deposit. And you can see that it has eroded out. But in fact, it's been colonized over here. So this was all underwater originally. This has been colonized and is stabilized by vegetation. And what we have here is a head cut. Okay, it's called a head cut. And it has become locked in place. So it hasn't continued to widen out and to go up. And if you think about if the goal for this project were to allow fish access, for example, right, we would not have succeeded. Because in this particular system, the fish can't get over that big a barrier. Now, this was not removed for fish access, but to sort of think about how this plays out, those are the kinds of questions you might ask. So the question is, why did this stop eroding at that point? Here's another one that also stopped eroding. So these are all reservoir sediments right here. Okay, we have a human surveying target there. This is from a colleague's work in Oregon, so that's not not a Stanford student. But what you can see is we have a several meter tall head cut, and that has stabilized. So what happened is this part of the sediment actually eroded out very quickly, and then it stopped. Well, why? Can we predict that? Can we tell what the likelihood is of that happening? Here is another case where instead of the sediment sort of cutting down and eroding back, this is the removal of a cofferdam at Marmot Dam, a very prominent dam removal from 2007, where all of the erosion took place right at the point of the breakthrough, and it went out very, very quickly, but then the projection upstream is a very different pattern than the projection that occurred at the site. So we aren't able yet to predict these kinds of consequences, and they're important. Here's another illustration. So here we see a removal where the sediment, almost 750,000 cubic meters of sediment were eroded out in less than 24 hours. And this little head cut here that actually migrated 420 meters in that 24-hour period. This is the one where the headline says things were even better than we thought because all the sediment just disappeared. Of course, the interesting question is, where did that sediment end up? And it's not, I'm not suggesting that's a bad thing, but I'm suggesting we ought to be able to predict that. And that's where we're headed here. On the other hand, here is another dam removal in which the head cut moved 277 meters, and so half of this distance, in 3 years. And again, that was not something that we were able to predict a priori. Right? Turns out with sediment, it's always much easier to explain afterwards. Well, I mean, that's good. But being able to predict these things is very important because, of course, the consequences, the costs and the benefits are a function of how the sediment is mobilized, what kind of ecosystem do we end up after we do that. And I would suggest that the only way we're going to be able to really get at this is by careful studies that combine all the tools that we have. So we need to use a lot of new monitoring and measuring technologies that we can apply at larger scales, and we need much more sophisticated and computationally intensive mathematical models to try to be able to capture the behavior. And so that's the kind of direction that we think we need to go in. Again, this is a small scale window into a complicated decision that we're going to have to make a lot of these decisions in the next 50 years. So there are all kinds of nifty questions coming back to my main categories, and I'll have more fun if you just ask me questions, so I will stop.
And we do have time for...
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.